Welcome back to Analysis, where we're discussing the Egyptian government's clampdown on civil liberties. The government claims these measures are a necessary evil in place to keep the country secure. Many in Egypt seem to agree. So is the revolutionary spirit in retreat in Egypt? With me in the studio are Vaughan Smith, founder of the Frontline Club, and Ahmed Abu Zaid, who's a Middle East commentator. Joining us on Skype from Washington is Sharif Mansour, Middle East and North Africa coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Welcome. Peter, we asked somebody from the Egyptian embassy to come on the programme, but they wouldn't. But you've had better luck. The Egyptian ambassador's heading your way on Monday. What are you expecting to say to him, and what are you expecting him to say to you?
No, and I think it's all credit to the ambassador for engaging and talking to us. So we're grateful that he's prepared to, and he's coming to see us in the Frontline Club, which is, London's press club, and we're going to assemble some highly regarded and well-known journalists to have a conversation with him where we can express the strength of our feelings about what's happened, because the thing is, Peter Grest, we know him very well. We know that the charges against him.
This is one of the arrested.
Yes, Peter Grest is currently in an Egyptian jail. I mean, he's an Australian journalist who was working for Al Jazeera, but he has a long reputation in journalism, and he's highly regarded. So we know that it's untrue, and you couldn't have a better way to communicate to the international press what's going wrong, and the press clampdown. It's iconic for that. It's not a sensible way to do it. So anyway, we're very grateful actually, because we will have the opportunity to make our case and try and express that and support Peter by doing so.
I mean, what do you make of this? Is there any credibility to the government's claims that that it can't allow journalists to simply report what they like, that the nation's profile internationally is at stake? Is that a reasonable point of view?
It's obviously not reasonable, and it's but something that's quite expected. Let's not forget that a lot of these members of the current regime were part of the old regime of Mubarak, including Sisi himself. So the tactics are quite in line with one another. That's one thing. The second thing is, if we look at the stage of military coup at this stage, or any military coup 6 months down the line, what they want is they want firm ground. They want to, by this stage, they want to have had people convinced with the fact that they are the legitimate government, between brackets, whether you like it or not. But now they want to get on. They've got a roadmap. They want to put it into place. They want to make it look real. They want the governments to start to give them the legitimacy they want. So Sisi's made his way to Russia to try and open that door for international countries to start inviting them over. The same with Greece. So it's obviously not justifiable at all. But you can understand it in context of a coup that they're looking to get firm grounding. And one thing they have to do is there can only be one voice or one kind of speech in the country, and everything has to be in harmony with her.
Sharif, welcome to the programme. There's been an enormous reaction, especially to the arrest of the Al Jazeera journalists. I mean, journalists on this channel, on Channel 4, on CNN, all around the world have reacted. Have you been surprised by the level of response to that campaign?
Not really. We think this is an unprecedented case, so it's naturally that we find unprecedented response. What is happening towards Al Jazeera, we have not seen in the Committee to Protect Journalists since 1981. And this is not just unprecedented globally, but also unprecedented in Egypt, where the government for the first time is using anti-terrorist charges against that many number of journalists at the same time. So yes, it's unprecedented, and that's why we've seen this grassroots campaign starting all over the world. And by the way, it didn't start in any Western country. It started in Nairobi, and then it began and moved everywhere around the world, including Western countries and the US. So yes, it is a political case, and yes, that's why it needs pressure to be able to be resolved, and for the government to understand that they cannot get away with it.
Vaughan, are you surprised by the scale of the campaign? I mean, it's quite phenomenal, because I mean, journalists are often, they're careful. They don't want to appear, certainly high-profile journalists, don't want to appear to be campaigning. They don't want to come out behind the kind of question of bias, but they have on this.
Well, yes, they have. I think there are several reasons. One of them is I think the circumstances are relatively exceptional. This is not what was expected from Egypt. The sense the public have certainly is that Egypt was on a road to a better place, and that it appears to have fallen down, and this is a reflection of that. But also, it's true. A lot of journalists feel that they don't like becoming the story. Peter Gress and other of the Al Jazeera journalists have written that that they're not happy being the centre of the story. It's professionally unacceptable to be so, and journalists. I think we all agree. I mean, there's not a great variety or variation in ethical standards in journalists in terms of what we believe is the ideal. We all actually agree. Sorry, dropping my phone there. Typical. But essentially, I think people appreciate we are allowed to campaign for press freedom. Journalists can do that, and we all agree with that. And there's something about the manner in which these journalists, who we know known so well to us, have been taken in, and the reasons for it. That yes, I think journalists are taking a stand, and we wish to communicate very clearly that this sort of behaviour is not in the public interest.
Sharif, just explain to us why you think it is that the government has acted against some journalists from some stations and not so much for others.
Well, I don't think that's like an accurate assessment. In our survey this year for imprisonment and killed journalists, we've highlighted a lot of the abuses that took place against journalists, and many of those do not belong to Al Jazeera. Some of them actually belong to the government media. So yes, Egypt has been for the first time on our risk list because it's now among the top 10 jailers of journalists, and also the third deadliest country for journalists, with 6 journalists being killed, including international journalists for the first time. So this is like a coordinated crackdown against journalism and an attempt by the government to criminalize journalist work. It's not necessarily Al Jazeera only, and it's consistent with a plan that was even leaked by some news outlets about how the military wanted to sway media towards working with them. And of course, once the military ousted President Morsi, they've moved quickly to censor everyone who does not agree with them, but now they are escalating that against everyone who is not abiding by their tow line.
What do you make of the fact that the satirist Bassem Youssef, who was kicked off television for criticising the military, is now back on the air? Is that a move in the right direction?
Absolutely. We've hosted Bassem Youssef here, and we've honored him as one of our awardees this year, and we think his satirism and his work is very important because it shows it's not like a one or way or the other. He's trying to bridge this political divide that is impacting the media and is causing the violence to increase, including violence against journalists. We know that his road is still not rosy yet. We know that even yesterday when he tried to shoot his second episode, people have intimidated his staff and tried to prevent him from going to his office. So that's still yet to be seen whether it's going to continue or not. But like any other things, it's kind of waves, and if you don't push back, of course you're not going to win your right to speak. So that's why we're happy to see Bassem pushing back, and we're hopeful that, like him, also Al Jazeera case will be dropped so that it's not going to be used as a chilling effect to silence every other news channel and critical and not so critical journalists.
Okay, Ayman, I don't suppose many people are going to object to people campaigning for freedom of the press, but there are many people who are in the jails in Egypt who've experienced, sadly, much worse than these journalists. We've just seen reports in the last few days of the return of systematic torture. It seems people being abused, sexually abused, electrocuted in custody. So this is the tip of an iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to do with a bit of double standards and a bit of materialistic calculating of who they want to, perceive as having the right to be defended and who not. I mean, for example, the European Union representatives were in Egypt, and they went to speak about 3 specific prisoners in jails and forgot about let's talk about the underage ones at least. They're the most vulnerable. I think as well, just linking that point to the question that you put to Sharif, he's right that there is a very, very small minority of non-Al Jazeera journalists and even in government press and television. But that's because in my understanding, the government wants those who are a bit more biased than being objective. Because, like I said in the beginning, it's all about being harmonious with the path that they want to follow now in order to put their feet down and get on with life. So they think.
Well, what do you make of this, of the connection between the campaigns around the journalists and the wider question of people who are being repressed for other reasons?
No, I mean, journalists will no doubt be being criticised for speaking out about other journalists being in prison. I think there's some fairness in that, but I think what you've got to remember is that the job of the journalist is to talk about the rest, and we won't be able to if we can't operate in journalism. It's absolutely in the public interest, and it's an interest in people, in the jails as well, that there are journalists reporting on it. Otherwise, they're more likely to be forgotten. I think the other point to observe is this doesn't work. All this does, this sort of treatment of people, is that it just breeds extremism and breeds problems in the future. And when one would have thought that we would have all learned the lesson that imprisoning people and torturing them ultimately you can do so much, but it will come back and create a society that is is more rotten, and you end up with all sorts of problems with extremists and things like that are really not necessary. Most people are not like that. Most reasonable people in Egyptian society simply don't want any of this stuff. They want to get on with their lives, and they want to have the respect that we all believe we deserve. And they want to be informed if they can participate. You can't participate in a democracy or any society without the information to be able to do so.
Yeah, Sharif, what do you make of the kind of resources of support that the regime has? Because it's true to say, as Vaughan just has, that many people in Egypt object to this, but there's also been a substantial kind of reservoir of support for it. Why do you think that is, and do you think it's eroding?
Well, unfortunately, the regime was very successful in promoting an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and mistrust against journalists. And they have waged this media vilification against Al Jazeera and against foreign journalists, accusing them of being agents and also harming Egyptian national security. And that touches on a very vulnerable position in the Egyptian psychology, where people have felt that they have been, either under Mubarak, people were very angry at the U.S., for example, for being supportive of the Mubarak regime, but also because Qatar as a government have supported President Morsi with billions of dollars in aid and investment. It was much easier for the Egyptian government and the military to portray Al Jazeera and portray foreign correspondents of being agents and people who are working against Egypt national interests. So for many reasons, a lot of Egyptian people are very suspicious, and the government have been skillful in trying to portray this image, and they have a banner of war against terrorism that they're trying to enforce in order to bring everyone on their camp and stop question any abuses by the government. We don't think that's gonna fly for a long time. It can happen that you can win some people sometimes, but not everyone all the time.
Eamon, do you think that one thing that's happening here, I've referred to it, and we've referred in the discussion to it being a clampdown or a crackdown, but actually it's something more than that, isn't it? There's if you, and I think Vaughan suggested this, when you're talking about a counter-revolutionary mood, you're talking about degrees of polarisation and degrees of violence which are outside the normal frame that you would refer to as a clampdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Sharif said, the banner of terrorism, that's it, you can do what you want. You know, even Cameron himself said, you know, if it's to do with national security, don't talk to me about human rights, except that they have a more extreme version in Egypt. And I think with trying to take control of the mentalities in Egypt, the mentalities of the people, it was important to be so ambitious in what banner you put up so that you can, you know, shove anything under that banner. So it's definitely, and like you say, it's important to look at the context. It's a revolution that started 3 years ago, a democratic president which, you know, the army weren't happy with, came into power, then he got toppled. So there's obviously a context there where there's an old regime or an old system or old way of life that had to sustain, that didn't, it got interrupted, so it's time to put it back on track again.
I mean, Vaughan, some of the families in the last 24 hours of the people who've been tortured are saying this is worse than Mubarak. Do you think that's true, or do you think that because kind of the Mubarak state was a kind of steady state repression, whereas this has got to reimpose repression after a period of relative freedom? Do you think that perhaps in that sense it is worse?
From what I hear from other journalists, people are quite surprised how bad it is, how bad it's become. And yes, I think it's reasonable to suggest that it's part of some strategy to reimpose an order. And I think yes, but I think that what we've got to realise it is a great concern. I think it's not helping Egypt's international reputation. The government is losing significant amounts of trust, and you know, arresting journalists is a two-edged sword, because it's the best way to communicate that there's a clampdown is to arrest the journalists. I mean, I find that quite an extraordinary thing to do. And when you elevate it to international journalists, you're making an international statement about what you think about journalism, and you know, it would be foolish to assume that, you know, as I say, so many of the world's great communicators aren't going to see that as evidence of a clampdown against journalism, and you know, it's hard to argue against.
Sharif, how would you compare the regimes, the Mubarak regime, then the post-Mubarak regime, the SCAF regime, then the Mohamed Morsi's regime, and now this? How would you judge the effective amount of freedom that Egyptians and journalists had under those regimes?
Well, they were all bad. Some are worse than others. We think that right now is probably the worst climate of press freedom we've ever seen in Egypt since 1981. And that's supported by numbers. We, for for example, monitoring every year. We have a database of journalists who've been killed because of their work or while doing their work. And you can see under Mubarak, there were, for almost 20 years, only one journalist being killed because of their work, because there were other ways of pressuring journalists and intimidating them using security forces to force them into self-censorship. After the revolution, there was a breaking of the fear barrier. So we've seen over a few years some sort of opening in the system that allowed journalists to operate. They were empowered by the spirit of the revolution. They were taking more risks. That didn't mean that they were not oppressed. The military government that came after Mubarak tried to pressure journalists, and because the journalists were empowered, they were united, they were able to push back. Later, when Mohamed Morsi took power, on over a 1 year period, there were several tactics trying to enforce censorship and threaten journalists using Mubarak-era tactics, including, using criminal defamation laws, insult charges. Up to 600 cases were filed against journalists, but that didn't work in most of the times. And it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as what we saw since July, when 5 journalists were killed and dozens were arrested, detained, and many of them were tortured and abused during custody. We saw direct censorship. The government were not shy on shutting down TV stations, raiding offices of media organizations, and eventually what we saw with the crackdown on Al Jazeera.
Eamon, I mean, Vaughan was saying that if you want to transmit a really bad image of what's happening, then arresting foreign journalists is probably the way to do it. But I mean, I must say there was one image this week which I think even people who've been willing to give the present government the benefit of the doubt must have found shocking, and that was the erection of 12-foot high steel gates on the entrances to Tahrir Square. This is the iconic place of assembly for the entire Egyptian revolution. To have it closed off in that way, some of the images I saw was with the Egyptian flag painted right across the streets on these gates. I mean, you'd be hard put not to get the message there, wouldn't you?
I think if we look at their strategy quite holistically, I think there's a large percentage of using the Mubarak tactics, and if we just go into a degree of depth on how Mubarak was dealing with the human psychology in Egypt, it was very much a lot of people living under a line of poverty, and it's important that you don't have the time or the capacity or the wealth or the sustained living condition to be looking at your political and economic rights and going beyond that round circle of, just trying to get the bread and butter on the table. And I think that's the kind of tactic they're using now, except that it's going to be a lot more tougher because it wasn't tough enough, and that's why the 2011 revolution took place. Now, obviously, like you say, it's absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. And it's just sending the same message as the gates that are closed in the face of those Palestinians in Gaza who even tried to come out just for simple treatment. So, I personally feel that there will still be more tactics in place because the streets are still boiling, the people are still speaking out, and a lot of people, they try to portray it as a Muslim Brotherhood versus government thing, which is absolutely untrue, and a lot of evidence to refute that. But I think now that they've found a lot of people, just mainstream people in the country, no affiliations or anything, coming on board as well, so it's quite important to go back to those old tactics quick, but the circumstances are a lot more different, and poverty is going down a lot more quicker as well.
OK, well, thank you all very much. That brings us to the end of this programme. But we've followed the fate of the Egyptian revolution since its very first days, and we'll be following it still in future editions of Analysis. Do rejoin us.